Hello, it's week 3, and here we are again. I am going to do the usual, do a few housekeeping things, and then we'll talk about the chapters 11 through 16 that are assigned for reading for this week. And I'll refer you back to, I've put up another Watch Me about the article analysis that's due Wednesday night at midnight. And I will, then I'll let y'all go. I do want to start with a couple of things, and these have to do with some of the things that you've been posting in your forum posts. And I'm going to start with where I was asking you to choose objective or interpretive approach and then take that and apply it to the type of research you want to do. Take your hunch and then go ahead and see what type of way you would approach it, just so you understand how some of these theories are arrived at. I was fascinated because, Chapter 2, when you read that, is clear about what objective research is usually used for. And there were a number of you all who said you chose an interpretive approach because you're looking at human behavior. And the objective approach is used more for studying human behavior, interpersonal communication skills, some of these things we're talking about in the first chapters. More often than not, they use the objective approach. And the reason is because of the preciseness of it, because it's a scientific method. With the interpretive method, you're interpreting too much into those human behaviors often. So to protect from that, they do things like design experiments. And in reading your first articles, you'll notice how some of the studies have been designed to look at some of the human behavior things. So remember that, and by the way, there is no perfect way, all right? So there are always going to be shortcomings. And there are also many issues that come into play because of the type of approach that you choose. You will lean towards one. A lot of y'all have mentioned, well, I could see where I could use both here, and I think I like this one, but I like that one too. And depending on the situation, context definitely affects what approach you use. But most researchers have a favorite approach that they use. So, when you have someone who loves using the objective approach because of its preciseness, all right, they most likely are going to use the objective approach mostly. So anyway, just, a few little gray areas there. Not anything, grading type of things that I'm looking at. But I have made some comments when I'm posting your grades for the forums about, no, they do use the objective approach to look at human behavior. So keep that in mind. Always it's contextual. There is no better way to do it. There may be a better way to do it because of the context, but neither one of those approaches is better than the other. All right. So one of the things about that is the way we get to it being a theory, all right, is that they replicate, means they repeat studies. So that if you read about a study and you say, oh, look at those shortcomings, I could replicate that and control for some of that, then I come up with a stronger theory about communication. So anyway, they do replication to strengthen the that actual theory. So one of the things a lot of y'all mentioned was about using surveys. Keep in mind that self-reporting, if you're when you take research methods down the road here, you'll hear more about that. But self-reporting is not always the best way to go because people don't self-report the truth, right? Or they self-report their perception. And so it's a case of surveys, you have to make sure that they've been pre-tested so that they rule out some of those types of things. Last of all, I don't know how many times I can say this, but some of y'all are not picking up on the norm of reciprocity. You're calling it mimicking. It's not really 100% mimicking, but it's a case of how I communicate. I should expect you to communicate in a similar way. All right. And that's in the theory. The textbook calls it the law of reciprocity. I call it the norm of reciprocity. And the reason I call it norm of reciprocity is that's how I learned it. That's how I studied it when I was in college. And that whole issue of the norm being what's normal. So it's normal to mimic other people. There's nothing abnormal about it. So, I say that, and there are cases where if you start doing that and mimicking other people uh, because of their differences, or there's a handicap, or there's an accent that you don't understand, etc. So. Some of y'all made mention about that, about mimicking the accent. I have a tendency to do that when I go to Maine. It's like, I start doing it. I can't do it right now sitting here because nobody's here doing it. But once I have a real close friend up there who has a real thick down east accent, and I start mimicking it. So anyway, those things are some of the things I've picked up on out of forum posts in the past week and a half. Okay, just a couple of other little things I'm trying to fix it so that sun doesn't hit me straight down the middle of my face. I wanted to get this done this morning because I was gone Saturday and yesterday and Sunday, so I didn't get it done. And so anyway, the next thing coming up is that you have the article analysis that's due on Wednesday at midnight. Remember, because some of you all, there are 7 of you all who did not turn in your tests on time, and that's horrendous. Okay, some of you, I didn't realize it was due at 5. It's all over the place, and it's due at 5. In the announcements, where you upload it, where you opened it from, at the top of the test in bolded red and yellow highlighting. Okay, so please don't tell me you don't know when it's due. It's like that just says a whole lot about you communication wise if you tell me that. The article analyses are always due at midnight on a Wednesday. All right. Tests are always due on Sundays at 5. All right. It's as simple as that. Just remember, Sunday at 5, Wednesday at midnight. All right. Sundays are tests, Wednesdays are article analyses, until we get to the last week. And I'll remind you there that there's a little bit of a change because we end on a class on a Tuesday. So I have a little bit of grading time, so I've made things do the same times as normal in most cases, so I don't mess you all up. And then you'll start your next 2 8-week classes. So I did, on the article analysis, post a little watch me just as an introduction. I'll move that out of the way. I left up the directions to finding an article through our library system. Remember, in that article, in that little watch me, I tell you, don't just give me the web address. I want correct bibliographic citing. If you're using our website, Appalachian's website, it'll tell you how to report the bibliographic information. Just click on it, open it, it shows you, copy and paste it. All right. And the reason is if it's not one of the ones I supplied, and you are not attaching it, which you are welcome to do also, open it, save it as a PDF, and attach it. Right? If you're not doing that, then I need to go find it, and I need the information to find it. I need the author and the title of the article and all those good things. So make sure that you do that. And again, you're welcome to use the ones that I listed, but you still include the bibliographic information. It's part of being a scholar, which all of you all are now. You're in college, you're studying an area, a discipline. I think of you all as young scholars, right? And I know some of y'all are older. Some of you may be my age. I doubt it, but anyway, there's that sign in my face again. Anyway, so make sure you watch the little video. I don't think it's terribly long. It's 13 minutes. And then the directions are there, where to find one. Written out directions, video directions, lots of directions. And then sample articles you're welcome to use. And it too says due Wednesday, September 4th at midnight. All right. Just like the test down at the bottom said, due Sunday, September 1 at 5 p.m. and still some of y'all say, I thought it was due at midnight. No. Anyway, um, I realize all of y'all are well, most of y'all are working and working full-time jobs, and I get that. The other thing is that with the hurricane approaching the coast, yes, I'm keeping an eye on it. And if you are, I have a few of you all. I believe someone said they lived in Southport, and someone says they lived out that way, but didn't tell me exactly where. You're going to tell me where you live. All right. If that comes about, you're going to just tell me where you live when you get access. If the electricity goes out. I don't expect you to use, like, especially if you're using your cell phone, I don't expect you to use it to, you'll get back with me if that happens. That's emergency mode. That's not, old lady Moore wants you to follow specific rules and guidelines for the class. So you're just going to let me know if you're one of those people. And yes, I can go look it up. I don't think anybody, don't use that as an excuse. These people that are in the line, in the pathway. I have friends that live in the Bahamas, the one that the hurricane's sitting over right now. In fact, when I first started this, you may have heard a ding. It was from one of my friends who lives in Hopetown, which is just off of Marsh Harbor and Abacos, which is the one that got hit yesterday. Friends since I was in high school. So anyway, I understand the gravity of the situation there. So don't use that when other people really are suffering. So, some people may lose houses, and chances are real good you'll lose electricity if it hits full on, which of course they're not sure yet. So anyway, that's, and that's due Wednesday, and that's about when the storm is supposed to hit the coast. So you might want to get it done today. That would be nice. And turn them in early. Because a few of you all have turned it in early. I haven't looked since Friday, but when I looked Friday, 2 people had already turned it in. So that means some of y'all are ahead of the game. And I like that. No, I'm sorry, only 1 person has turned it in, but I just opened it. Okay, get that thing out of my face. Okay, so then let's move along to the material we're going to talk about this week. We are doing chapters 11 through 13. 11 through 16, sorry. Yeah, I can't keep up with how many numbers are in here. So this section is about relationship maintenance. How do you maintain a relationship? Once you've built a relationship, right? The idea, hopefully, is to maintain it. If you decide you don't want to maintain it, then you're going to end it. So we also talk some about that, about end stages. And so there are good discussions here about how do you create communication-wise long-term satisfying relationships and the characteristics of that. They list 4: liking, duh; trust, duh; commitment to that relationship, duh; and control mutuality, which is a little bit different, which means that everybody has similar amounts of control. Like you may control one thing, but the other person controls the other. Now, this isn't just love relationships, folks. These are your best friends. These are families. These are all sorts of things. So it's all different types. Here, there's a good list there about how many different things help you maintain, all right, a positive relationship. Positivity, openness, assurances for the other person, networking, all right, spending time together is what that refers to, with mutual friends together. And then sharing tasks, all right, in the relationships. So, there are 3 well-known theories that are in this section, and one takes us back to the other, which we've already discussed, and that's his social exchange or social penetration theory. Because once that develops, right, it develops into the maintenance of the relationship. And then the next one is relational dialectics, which is what chapter 11 is about. And then the interactional view, about how do we interact together. So let's go to chapter 11 then. That's just the introductory material. There's always an introduction before you start into the chapters that are about that topic. Relational dialectics is Baxter and Montgomery's theory. Uh, and what that refers to are the tensions that you have in relationships, conflicts, clashes, interactions that are not quite comfortable for you. And it happens in all relationships. Even my best friend, there are things that she does and I'm like, well, okay, I'm not quite sure I like how you go about doing that. But so that's uh, the study of how that takes place in relationships, the conflicts, basically, clashes, interactional conflict, that kind of thing. And it can happen with friends, it can happen with romances, all right? And, what sorts of tensions and struggles do you have? So when you are in a close relationship, many of you are married, many of you, have significant others, many of you have children, all right? And you've had the dialectics, the relational dialectics with your children. So, what we have then is we have this tug of war between, I know this is a close relationship and I'm uncomfortable because I'm having conflict. There are things that we do differently. And then, of course, the idea is to how do you work out of the conflict? We have many different things. They talk about contradiction being the core concept of relational dialectics, which just refers that, you have oppositional positions at times, right? And everybody does. Even if they're you love that person with all your heart, you're still going to have some conflicts. There'll be things that you don't agree on. And a lot of y'all manage that by saying, well, we'll agree to disagree. So uh, the one thing, the things that pull you together, what they call the centripetal, P-E-T-A-L, centripetal, is the pulling together of who you are, even though you have those dialectics issues. And then we talk about the three different types of dialectics that affect the relationship. And before we talk about those three, just here for a second, you're going to have internal dialectics, and then you're going to have external dialectics. You're going to have things that cause you conflict, upset, contradictions, etc., in your brain. And then there are going to be things from the outside that cause that. All right. They talk about the external dialectics being between you as your they call it couple, but it could be your best friend, right? Between you and the community that you live in. So there are internal, all right, which also includes internal in the actual relationship, all right? So it's got a dual meaning there, internal and within your relationship there, and then external with what's outside of the relationship. And so the three things that you pay attention to are integration and separation, right? And that looks at things like how, and these are all continuums, integration, connectedness and separateness, inclusion. I hate doing this in the morning, because I usually do it later in the morning. So that isn't shining in my face, or when there's clouds up here. And inclusion and seclusion, intimacy and interdependence, closeness and autonomy. So, these are all aspects of integration and separation. And they talk about, some about how it's important to have, even with a romantic couple, to have your own separation time also. And probably most of you all could speak to that too. Stability and change, certainty versus uncertainty, conventionality versus uniqueness, etc. And you're going to see all these in the PowerPoint and in the textbook. But the idea of a stable relationships versus a changing relationship. Right? And then expression and non-expression. Some of you all are very expressive. Some of you all aren't. I'd read the one-liners and go, well, this one probably has more to say, but they just don't say a whole lot. All right. So that whole idea of how expressive are you? Excuse me a minute. Okay, and after we talk about those three dialectics, and then remember they're continuums, and where does your relationship fit in those characteristics? And then we look at the second generation of dialectics, and that comes from Batkin. That's not Baxter and Montgomery. Batkin comes in and says the only way to work through dialectics, issues, conflicts, etc., is guess what? Dialogue. Whoa, no, and that's a no-brainer theory. So the theory is, okay, so if you're having these conflicts that are going to happen, and that is theory, then the way to work through that, another theory, is to dialogue about it. And then Batkin talks about different types of dialogue, constitutive dialogue, the dialogue that sets your relationship, it creates, sustains, and alters even relationships that you have with other people. And then how you get in dialectical flux, it's like, okay, so this is changing, it's unpredictable, it's unfinalizable, as the textbook says. So and then you talk about dialogue as an aesthetic part of your relationship. That whole, oh, okay, it makes sense to me. And then utterance, which is part of saying what you're thinking, speaking up. And then dialogue is critical sensibility. And that's it, what Batkin would say was that you have a obligation to critique the dominant voices that are causing the problems of the dialectics problems. And the last thing is the ethical reflection. And this is interesting because I think most of y'all will identify with this, at least from what I can tell from what you've been posting so far. And this is a different theorist even, and the theorist was Bach, B-O-K. And this theorist, I don't know if it's male or female, Cicella, so I can't do it he or she. But this theorist says that there are consequences, all right? And so you have to pay attention to the consequences of the conflicts and things that go on, and that's a no-brainer. And refers to those as consequentialist ethics, based on the idea of what's beneficial and what's harmful to the relationship, right? And then the other one is the principle of veracity, truth, right? What is important to be truthful about, and how important is truth? And you'll read a good discussion in the textbook about this, and I'll probably ask a forum question about it, because we don't think about, do we have to be truthful all the time? Is it okay to tell a small little lie? The critique on this chapter deals with the fact that this is often used as an interpretive theory, after I've just told you that human behavior is usually studied by use of objective theory. But this one is more often looked at because you don't know the context. You don't know the situation. You don't know the relationship if you're looking at this. So you have to go about analyzing what people tell you. So, and I would refer you back to chapter 3 to go look at how we actually test for good theories, good interpretive theories, so standards. So chapter 12 is kind of fun. It's about the communication privacy management theory. It's a simple theory. It's like, well, what do you tell and what don't you tell? And Petronio is the most well-known theorist. There are a lot of people who do research in privacy management theory, also referred to as CPM. But what this deals with is privacy in your relationships and your boundaries. So they talk a lot here about privacy boundaries. What are the borders in your relationships between private and public information? All right. And most of y'all go, okay, well, these are things that we don't talk about outside our marriage. These are things that we don't talk about outside of our family. All right, and so those are privacy boundaries. Most of y'all probably remember some of that when you were a kid. Your mom or dad saying, "Well, don't say this in front of your grandmother," My mother used to do that all the time. So, those are privacy boundaries. And so what we have is we have some principles about that, that you have control of your private information. So if you're going to control your private information, what will you tell other people? And what goes outside once you share, the other person becomes the co-owner of that information, and what do they do with it once they've gotten it? So, privacy is a very important aspect of relationship, and especially relationship um, maintenance. Right? What's private in your relationships? What do you self-disclose about? And you all could probably make a list of that. I'm not asking as a rhetorical question. I'm asking you to think about that. So what do you keep? And I'll ask a question about this in some of the forum posts. What's kept private, or what happens when somebody violates, right? Which we'll talk about here in a second. You have a right to own your own information. Now, this is a very rule-based theory. So when you follow the rules, and what factors affect those rules? Well, your culture does, your relationship does, your sex and gender do, your motivation to keep information private, the context of the situation. What's the risk or benefits of sharing that private information? So it's very rule-based, what's kept privacy, what's kept private and isn't. And then when you have a relationship, then you have collective privacy boundaries. So you have your own, and then when you're in a relationship, you have the relationship's privacy boundaries also. And again, let's say it's your spouse or your significant other, or, romantic significant other. Co-ownership there comes back into play. So what do you tell, right? And what does your spouse or your partner or whomever tell? Right, so that co-ownership comes into play there. Obviously, in maintaining a relationship, this is one of those mornings, I guess. What you have to get to is mutuality, the mutual privacy boundaries with that other person, and then who decides, what gets shared and what doesn't. And when you have a shareholder, what happens if they share it and they break that? That's the violation part. And we'll talk again about in a second. And then we talk about linking, the boundary linkage that, that's an alliance that's formed with the co-owners of that private information as to who else should be able to know. And there are some legal things there because, they talk about if you know that somebody's abusing somebody, do you tell? Right? What sorts of things do you tell? And then boundary permeability means that it ebbs and flows. If let's say you're married and your spouse says, well, don't tell anybody this, but you have a real close relationship with your best friend and you tell them, most of y'all will put that rule out there. Please don't tell anyone of this. All right. This is private. All right. So don't say anything to someone. And so that boundary permeability, a little flux in there. So turbulence is the violation area. So that when somebody has violated, all right, they disrupt the privacy management for you. And so what you get is you get problems in the relationship, especially if someone finds out you have shared what you asked them not to share or what has normally been privacy in your relationship. And a couple of things affect that, like there might be fuzzy boundaries. You might not be sure what you weren't supposed to share. And then there might be intentional breaches. Somebody set out to share what you shared, and that's a confidentiality dilemma. And then somebody mistakes, all of us have done that before. It's kind of like you let it slip out. It's like, oops, I wasn't supposed to do that. Oops. So what happens in the relationship? The critique of this chapter is it does fit 5 of the 6 categories for the standards for interpretive theory. So, which is always good. If you get 5 out of 6 in those standards, that's doing pretty well. One of the things that is a critique is that Petronio does not give you much of a way to negotiate the boundaries. So she just talks about that the boundaries are there, but not much else about how to actually do it. Chapter 13 is about the interactional view, and what it does is it looks at family communication as a system. It's a systematic thing. It's a short chapter, but it's important to look at it because some of the most important interpersonal communication axioms, principles, AXIOM, we've mentioned that word before, come out of this theory, all right? And so those axioms are important. So the first one is one cannot not communicate, all right? And what that says, and a lot of people kind of argue with that one, but because what's intentional, what isn't intentional. But even if you're sitting there and you're talking to someone, you're still communicating. Even if it's not coming out of your mouth, you're communicating nonverbal, etc. So even if you say, but I don't want to talk, that's still communicating. So, you know, that whole idea of one cannot not communicate. Then another axiom, and we've mentioned this one before, is that communication equals the content plus the relationship, or content plus relationship equals communication. All right. And that just means that communication is always based on the content of what you're talking about and the relationship that exists. And then meta communication comes into play there, which is just communication about communication. And most of you, all who are in serious relationships, marriage, a couple of y'all mentioned that you're living with your significant other, etc. You know, you communicate about your communication, and that's called meta communication. The nature of the relationship depends on how both parties punctuate the communication sequence, which that just means that you label one event and there's a beginning and an end. So like punctuation begins and ends. It's sequenced, you know. One of the things I always talk about here, and I think I talk about it in the PowerPoint, is that how you punctuate deals with in our culture, people just often start right into the business. My office neighbor on this side of me, he's since passed away, but was from Uganda, and you never started a conversation with him about business types of things without an opening, right? Hello, Jacob. How are you doing today? I hope you're having a great day. Take care of the business, and then you bring closure. That's part of punctuation, right? Always at the end, he would say, well, I hope you have a wonderful day. Right, and I hope you have one too, you know. But we in America don't always communicate that way. I know you can see this one. It's hot in here too. No air conditioning on the weekends. The fourth axiom principle is that communication is either symmetrical or complementary, meaning that it's similar with you and the other person that you're communicating with, the other person in the relationship, or it's complementary, like you fit each other. All right, you do it this way, and you know, let's say one of you all is very extroverted in your family and in your significant other relationships, and one of you is very introverted. So, but you've found how that works, how that's complementary. Well, this person takes the role of speaking, etc. So this also is where we talk about in the symmetrical and the complementary is one-up communication. That's communication that's done to gain control. I want to take control. That's one-up communication. You know, you try to instruct other people how to do things. You order them to do other things. You interrupt. You contradict, etc. And I will be asking questions about that in the forum posts. All right. One-down communication is when you yield control of the exchange, so it comes across that you're submissive. And these are discussed in more detail in the PowerPoint. And then one across, where more equal, more level types of situations. This is like I said, it's a short theory, but it's an important one. You know, they talk about some of the critiquing of it, about how we're trapped in a system with no place to go. You know, you have enablers. And you have double bind messages where somebody says something, but the message is really something different. A lot of y'all passive aggressiveness and have pointed out passive aggressiveness before. And then finally about reframing. You know, you can change the rules on these axioms by just shifting things that you do things differently. The axioms are, they've been criticized a whole lot in the critique here. I cannot believe it. Here I am on a Monday morning, Labor Day, and the air conditioner did just cut on while I'm sitting there sweating. Get my head under the vent. Anyway, the axioms have been criticized because they think that maybe you should be looking at the whole message and not pick it apart like the axioms do. And then equifinality about the outcome. You know, it's a system theory that's based on given outcomes. So anyway, so that's chapter 13. And we move on to chapter 14, which starts a new section. Now, this section is about influence in relationships. We will look at it also in the public area. We talk about things like compliance gaining strategies. How do you get people to comply with you? And so we're looking more about attitude change than behavioral change. This air conditioning feels great. Anyway, so we're going to look at the 3 different domains that we talk about when we talk about psychological changing of people. One is the cognitive, is what do you honestly believe. One is the affective, which is the emotional area, AFF, right? And then behavioral, what do you do? And we're going to be looking mostly here in these 3 chapters at the cognitive and affective. So we'll look at how do you persuade, but interpersonal persuasion. So, chapter 15 is about the social judgment theory, this simple one, all right? When somebody tries to persuade you, you're going to have, all right, and this is Sharif, very famous. It's also used in public persuasion too, but also in interpersonal. 3 latitudes, all right? Latitude of acceptance, latitude of non-commitment, and latitude of rejection. And it's a continuum, all right? Can't quite get the camera right today. So acceptance, non-commitment, rejection. All right. And so how do you get people there? So the latitude of acceptance is when people hear things that they think is reasonable enough and worthy enough of consideration. Rejection, opposite. All right. Person finds it unreasonable or objectionable. And then non-commitment means, oh, I could go either way. Let me listen here. All right. And so that those zones, as they call them, so that when you hear a message, it's going to fall somewhere there. Now, ego involvement comes into play here. How much ego involved are you in making this decision? Because ego involvement, the more ego involved you are, the harder it is going to be to change you. All right. So that ego involvement becomes an extremely important part of it. When you have ego involvement, there's an issue of anchor point. This is my anchor point. This is what I think. This is what I feel. All right. Everything is anchored off of that. It may be your faith. It may be your idea of business ethics. All right. That's my anchor point. I won't cross over that. So that if you're there, you're going to be in that rejection if somebody's trying to get you to cross over that. So, and, you know, there are people who are highly ego involved and people who are not highly ego involved. And it's a process it's a 2-step process. You hear the message, you evaluate it, and then you make the decision. All right. Then the biggest way that people do that is to try, you know, contrast and assimilation are a part of this. I call it contrast and assimilation errors. You know, this is whereby a contrast is whereby people hear your message and they think it's further away from your position than it really is. And then assimilation is when you hear things and you assimilate it back into, oh yeah, well that's what I thought anyway. All right, and areas that are close enough in that latitude of acceptance that happens with. So there has to be a discrepancy. All right, and we're going to talk about that in one of the upcoming chapters here in a second. So the discrepancy causes why you have to make that change. All right, if you're in agreement, there isn't any persuasion that can move in there except to make you feel more strongly about whatever it is. And the greater the discrepancy, all right, the more the hearers will adjust their attitudes if they're going to adjust. So There is the boomerang effect, where somebody tries to do something and the attitude changes in the exact opposite area of the direction you wanted it to go. So, that's an important one to take, because if you go about it the wrong way, it gets rejected. All right. So you get a boomerang effect there. So, they give some good practical advice on how to be better persuaders in your relationships, being sure that you're credible, sometimes being more ambiguous than clear. All right, so depending on the situation. And then the critique of this chapter deals with how wide is your theoretical latitude of acceptance. This theory raises some ethical questions about how you go about persuading people, because you could be untruthful. We go back a couple chapters to the principle of veracity. So it's kind of a fun one to look at, but it's not always the best one, because it does have some criticism. Chapter 15 is the elaboration likelihood model. And what the elaboration likelihood model deals with is, it's Petty and Cacioppo. What they deal with is the brain's route to persuasion. All right, so do we go the central route or do we go the peripheral route? The central route, when you hear a message, all right, one of the ways we define persuasion is that you don't ever persuade someone. The person persuades themselves. They make that decision, all right? You don't have anything to do with their decision. If you do and you force the decision, that's what that is. That's coercion. You let the person make their decision. So the central route is going through the route that involves message elaboration. I want you to think more about this. I want you to create the message about this. Advertising uses that all the time. They want you to see that message and create, all right, elaborate on that message in your brain so that you buy their product. All right, I'll look beautiful if I wear this. I'll smell great if I do this. I'll have all the boys chasing me if I have this. All right, I'll have all the women after me. All right, so that's message elaboration. That's not what's going on in the ad, right? But that's how people persuade people to do things. So that's the central route. All right, the peripheral route is just a mental shortcut, and there are things that people do to other people to try and get them to do. I love them there because they call it, if you want to trigger a quick programmed response, reciprocation, you owe me, so you have to do this. That's not really a great form of persuasion. We've always done it this way, so we should keep doing it this way. Everybody's doing it, and so forth. And those are both in the textbook and on the PowerPoint. Message elaboration is the extent to which a person carefully thinks through whatever it is you're talking about and trying to persuade them about, comes up with their own decisions, right, to do whatever it is you're asking them to do, or they may choose not to. All right, and that's part of persuasion also. There's a good model in the textbook on page 190, so you'll want to make sure you look at that. Is the motivation for elaboration, is it worth the effort that you put into it? Yeah, probably. Right? We have a desire to be cognitively clear. So that's where it plays into. Right? We have a need for cognition, the textbook calls that. You do have to worry about what the people, most of us know some people who are unable, speech teacher. They're unable to do that message elaboration. They just don't quite get it. All right. And so, what happens, they get distracted and your message doesn't take place. People's biases are going to come into play in that elaboration. There'll be objective elaboration also, but many of the things that come into play there have to do with how people's brains work, or the people that you're communicating with. People's credibility, all right? The speaker, whoever you are, do you have credibility with this person, with these people? Yeah, and they talk some in here, by the way, about how celebrities are able to influence other people too. So, it's as the textbook will tell you, Petty and Cassiopo emphasized that it's impossible to compile a list of cues that are strictly peripheral or strictly central. So you play that game. The critique on ethical thing here is that we all have free choice, and so there's a question about whether or not, if you're playing with the elaboration likelihood techniques, all right, whether or not that's ethical for the people who are experiencing it. The critique is that the elaboration model needs more elaboration. So I think that's kind of funny, but anyway, so that's kind of fun. We use that more in persuasion. When I teach persuasion, I teach a lot about the elaboration likelihood model, because that's the model that gets the people to buy the product that they have seen advertised. Last chapter is cognitive dissonance. All right. In my opinion, it's very simple. Other people say it's not that easy, but this is Festinger's theory. And with cognitive dissonance, we have two terms, consonance and dissonance. Consonance is even, all right, balance. Dissonance is imbalance. And this is quite simply how it works, folks. When you're trying to persuade me, all right, dissonance needs to exist, all right? Because if we're here, you're not persuading me. You may strengthen what I'm thinking about, but you're not persuading me, all right? So dissonance means that persuasion can move in, and we can do a couple of things. You can persuade me to believe what you believe, all right? Or I can persuade you to believe what I believe, or guess what? We can meet in the middle and get in consonance that way. It's as simple as that. It's where persuasion moves in when we have the dissonance. So that's an important part of the process of trying to persuade people. And there's a good discussion in here about smokers, if any of y'all smoke, you know that. You know it's bad for your body, but you still do it. All right? That's dissonance. All right? That's being created there. And so there's a good discussion, good example in the textbook about the smoking aspects. They tell you ways to reduce the dissonance when you're trying to persuade people. Selective exposure, post-decision dissonance, sorry. That's where you've made the decision and you've made that change. All right, let's say I get you to come all the way up here, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have. Right? Most of y'all probably have done that. You've bought something before. You go, yeah, maybe a new car. Maybe I shouldn't have. All right. So, and then minimal justification is an important aspect of this. The best way to stimulate attitude change in others is to offer just enough incentive to get them to make the change, so that they get this counter attitudinal behavior. So getting people to comply with you. There's good examples in the textbook about some experiments you could do with that. The cause and effect, about self-consistency, how people appreciate that, taking personal responsibility for any bad outcomes. How do I lessen the dissonance? And usually the way you lessen the dissonance is to agree with whatever has caused the dissonance, so with the persuader. Good tips towards the end of that chapter about, what you don't, theory into practice. How do you persuade? Don't promise lavish benefits or warn of dire consequences if somebody doesn't agree. Massive reward punishment strategies, not the best way to go. Should offer just enough encouragement, minimal justification that we just mentioned, for the person to want to try it out. Try out your idea, try out whatever it is you're trying to get them to do. And as you try to seek consensus or compliance, try to get the person to count the cost of what they're doing, that you want them to do, because lots of people will do that cost benefit analysis, all right, easily. So the critique of this is that it's too simple. Okay, it is simple, but some people don't think it's that simple. But you know, but the biggest critique is that there's no real reliable way to try and teach people how to do the dissonance, to get people to change, to make the dissonance disappear. So, and it's more detailed in the PowerPoint in the textbook, but to me, it's a simple theory. It may not be to you, so if you have troubles with it, just ask me. So, okay, that's it for the chapters for this week. Again, article analyses are due Wednesday at midnight. If you're in the hurricane path and it does hit North Carolina, you're going to contact me, all right? If you don't have electricity at the time, you'll get back with me once you get it. So, anyway, I hope you all have a great week. And those of you that are down at the coast, please stay safe. And I will see you again next weekend. Bye.